I heard my wife tell our closest friends, right there in my own dining room, on our own anniversary, that I was dead weight. Not tired, not moving a little slower, dead weight. The entire table became silent in a way I had never experienced before. Every person sitting there seemed to stop breathing at the same time. And I just sat there and smiled, pretending I was a man who hadn't just been cut open in front of 12 people who had known me for 3 decades. At the time, I thought that was going to be the worst night of my life. I was wrong. It wasn't even close.
At exactly 11 that same night, my phone rang. A woman I had never met and had never spoken with before asked for me by name. She told me she was calling for my wife's attorney. Then, over the next 4 minutes, she told me things about my marriage, my company, and my future that I hadn't known 1 hour earlier. Under normal circumstances, I probably would have laughed at some of it. I might even have accused her of having the wrong number. But she read the information from paperwork in a calm, professional voice, and there was something about the way she spoke that made it clear this wasn't a misunderstanding. My name is Walter Combs. I'm 66 years old. I make furniture for a living. Or, at least, I used to make most of it with my own hands, before my hands became more useful running the company than working the wood. I live just outside Asheville, North Carolina, up on Sunset Mountain Road, in the same house I completely paid off 9 years ago. For most of my adult life, I believed something very simple. I believed that if you worked hard enough, loved people deeply enough, and kept showing up for the people who mattered to you, those people would eventually show up for you when you needed them. I was wrong about that. Not completely wrong. Some people did show up for me. But I was wrong enough that my belief nearly cost me everything I had spent my entire life building. This is one of those stories I can remember almost perfectly. I remember the smell of the food. I remember the candles burning down. I remember the sound of silverware against the plates. I even remember the coffee sitting untouched in front of me as it slowly went cold. And more than anything, I remember the exact expression on my wife's face when she called me dead weight. But before I tell you what happened that night, I need to take you back a little. You need to understand what ordinary life looked like inside my house before everything started falling apart. I started Combs Fine Woodworks in 1998, working out of a 2-car garage on Depot Street. Back then, Asheville was still much more of a mill town with mountain views than the place it eventually became. The tourists hadn't completely taken over. The breweries weren't everywhere. The city felt smaller, quieter, and more familiar. In those days, I built dining tables one customer at a time. I measured the wood myself, cut every piece myself, sanded every edge, and delivered finished tables in the back of a used Ford pickup that cost me $2,200. I remember that truck because I spent months worrying about whether I could afford it. I didn't have much money, but I had a belief that if I could keep making good furniture, people would eventually notice. They did. By 2010, we had moved into a proper shop on Riverside Drive. It was about 6,000 square feet, and we had contracts with hotels from Charlotte all the way down to Charleston. They weren't looking for cheap furniture made from particle board with a thin layer of veneer stapled over it. They wanted real wood, real joinery, pieces that looked like they had been made by somebody who cared about what they were doing. By last year, the company had 42 employees. We had a waiting list that stretched almost 11 months. People knew our name. Around this part of North Carolina, our reputation actually meant something. I built that business with sawdust in my lungs, cuts on my hands, and my wife's name right beside mine on the incorporation documents. Diane and I had started everything together in 1998. At least, that's how I remembered it. Diane Combs was 63. We got married in June of 1991 at a small Methodist church just off Marymount Avenue. For a very long time, if someone had asked me what the best decision of my life had been, I would have answered without hesitation, marrying Diane. We raised 2 children in that house on Sunset Mountain Road. Our son, Preston, is 31 now. He carries the title of Vice President of Sales at the company. I'll be honest with you though, on a lot of days, that title means he answers a few emails, makes some phone calls, and takes long lunches with clients who probably could have closed the deals without him. But he was my son, and I wanted to believe I was giving him something bigger than a job. Our daughter, Callie, is 28. She teaches kindergarten at a school in Black Mountain, about 20 minutes from our house. She calls her mother almost every day. Me? Maybe once a week. Usually, she just calls to check on me. She never calls to ask for money. She never calls because she needs a favor. She never calls because she wants something from the business. I want you to remember that detail. It becomes important later. About 4 months before that anniversary dinner, I had a health scare. The cardiologist at Mission Hospital described it as a moderate ischemic event. If you want the simpler word, you could call it a mild stroke. It happened on a Wednesday morning in April. I was standing at my bandsaw when the left side of my face suddenly went numb. I remember looking down at the wood in front of me and realizing something was wrong. Then, everything becomes blurry in my memory. The next thing I can remember clearly is a nurse named Priya asking me to squeeze her hand. I spent 4 days in that hospital. After that came another 6 weeks of physical therapy. I had to relearn things I had never thought twice about before, including how to hold a pencil properly. Coming back to work was harder than I wanted to admit. My speech was fine. My memory was fine. My mind was still working exactly the way it always had. But by the end of a long day, my right hand sometimes shook. I couldn't stand at a workbench for 8 hours anymore, not the way I could when I was 40. So I started giving more of the floor work to my shop foreman. His name was Miguel Ortiz. Miguel had been with me for 15 years. I trusted him with the keys to that building. In fact, I trusted him with things I wouldn't have trusted to most people on Earth. He knew the machinery. He knew the employees. He knew how I liked the work done. More importantly, he knew what the company meant to me. I thought stepping back was simply part of getting older. I thought my family understood that. I didn't realize the stroke had also given certain people in my life something else. A calendar, a countdown, and, apparently, an opportunity. The anniversary dinner was held on a Saturday evening in late September. It had been exactly 34 years since that little church off Marymount Avenue where Diane and I had promised each other our lives. Diane wanted to celebrate properly, and I want to be fair to her here. At the time, I was happy she wanted to make a big evening out of it. She invited around 14 people. Our neighbors, the Halversons, who lived farther down the mountain, Pastor Dan and his wife from Grace Fellowship, the church we'd attended for 20 years, my sister Joyce, who had driven down from Boone, Preston and his girlfriend Ashley. Callie came by herself. She had ended a relationship that spring and hadn't brought anyone new around since. Then there was Gary Whitfield. Gary was our company's chief financial officer. I've hired him 11 years earlier. I trusted Gary with practically every financial number that mattered to my business. Payroll, taxes, contracts, accounts, projections. If there was a number connected to the company, Gary probably knew it. His wife, Renata, came with him. Diane had prepared a standing rib roast, the expensive kind we didn't buy very often. She brought out the china we normally used only twice a year. There were candles on the table, cloth napkins, polished silverware, and all the little details that made it obvious she had put serious effort into the evening. For the first hour, it was exactly what an anniversary dinner should have been. Pastor Dan gave a toast about commitment. Joyce told an embarrassing story from our wedding day that had everyone laughing, including me. Preston talked about a client he'd been trying to impress. Callie asked me how the shop was doing, and I sat at the head of that long table with my wife of 34 years sitting to my right. For a while, I allowed myself to believe that the last 4 months hadn't changed anything. Maybe that sounds foolish now. It was foolish. But when you've spent more than 3 decades building a family, you don't immediately assume that the people sitting across from you are secretly planning your replacements. You assume they're your family. Then someone, I think it was Renata Whitfield, asked how the business transition was going. It was an innocent question. At least, that's how it sounded. Half the people around that table knew about my health scare. A few of them had heard, correctly, that I had been spending less time on the shop floor and allowing Miguel to handle more of the physical work. Diane put her wine glass down. Then she smiled. It was the same smile she used at church when she greeted people she barely knew. Warm, pleasant, polite. But underneath it was something else, something practiced. "Oh, it's going," she said. "Walter's been such a trooper about it." And that's where everything changed. I just sat there because I honestly didn't know what to do with any of it. I didn't know how to tell Mom no, and I kept telling myself that I wasn't really hurting you, that it was only business, that somehow business and family could be kept separate. I wanted to believe that, because believing it made everything easier to ignore. I felt something inside my chest become completely still and very cold, and I looked at Preston before saying, "Preston, it wasn't just business. It was my life, and you knew that. You knew exactly what that company meant to me, how many years I had put into it, how many mornings I had walked through those shop doors before the sun was even up, and how many nights I had stayed there long after everyone else had gone home. You knew all of that. So don't tell yourself it was only business, because it wasn't. It was personal.
It was my life, my work, my name, and everything I had spent decades building.
I want to tell you what happened during the weeks that followed, because this is where the sweetness of this story really begins. And I promised myself a long time ago that I would never tell a story that was only about what I took away from other people, because that isn't the man I want to become. Even after everything that happened, even after the betrayal, the lies, and the things I discovered, I didn't want my life to become a story about revenge. I wanted it to be about what I learned, who stayed, who mattered, and what I chose to do with what was left. The Buncombe County District Attorney's Office moved ahead with charges against Gary Whitfield for embezzlement and insurance fraud. And Gary was terminated from Combs Fine Woodworks effective immediately. His name was removed from every account, every vendor relationship, every internal record, and every piece of paperwork that had ever carried his signature. It was strange seeing how quickly a person could disappear from a business after spending so many years attached to it. One day, his name had been everywhere, and then suddenly, it was gone. The Ridgeline Capital sale collapsed completely once their legal team learned about the pending fraud investigation. Their interest disappeared almost overnight. And honestly, that suited me just fine. I had never wanted to sell that business in the first place. Not for $2.1 million, not for $4 million, and not for any amount a stranger could write on a piece of paper. Money has a way of making certain decisions look simple when they really aren't. To someone who has never built something from nothing, a number like $2.1 million can look like the obvious answer. But to me, Combs Fine Woodworks wasn't just an asset. It wasn't a building, a list of machines, a collection of contracts, or a number on a balance sheet. It was my life. I had started that company in a two-car garage with a used Ford truck and very little money. I had worked through lean years when I wasn't sure if the next month would be better than the last. I had made mistakes, learned from them, worked until my hands hurt, and watched that little operation slowly become something that could support other families besides my own. So when Ridgeline Capital walked away, I didn't feel like I had lost something. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had gotten something back.
Diane and I finalized our divorce 3 months later. I want to be completely honest with you about the settlement because people always ask about that part of the story. Under North Carolina law, and with the documented fraud and infidelity included in the record, my attorney was able to negotiate a settlement that was far more modest than the one Diane had originally expected when she walked into Patricia Vance's office 11 days after my stroke. I won't pretend that the process was easy. Nothing about divorce is easy when you have spent years believing that the person standing beside you is the person who knows you best.
She kept the house on Sunset Mountain Road because, by then, I didn't want it anymore anyway. There were too many rooms and far too many memories attached to that place. Every hallway seemed to hold a conversation I wished I could forget. Every corner reminded me of that dining room table, the candles, the china we only used twice a year, and the sentence that had changed the way I saw my own marriage. The house had stopped feeling like home, so I let it go. I kept full ownership and control of Combs Fine Woodworks. I also restructured the company in a way I should have considered years earlier. Miguel Ortiz, who had been with me for 15 years and had quietly carried more responsibility than almost anyone realized, received a genuine 15% stake in the company. His new title finally matched the work he had already been doing for years: shop partner and operations director.
Watching Miguel sign those papers was one of the most satisfying moments of the entire process.
He looked at me and said, "You sure about this?" I told him, "I'm sure about you." He didn't say much after that. Miguel was never a man of many words. He just nodded, folded the papers carefully, and went back to work. That was Miguel. No speeches, no celebration, no demands, just work. Preston and I still talk, occasionally, but carefully. We speak in the way two people speak when trust has to be rebuilt, one small, honest conversation at a time, instead of simply being assumed because of family. It isn't the same relationship we had before, and I don't think either of us expects it to be. Some things can be repaired, but they don't always go back to exactly the way they were. He's not in the business anymore. I told him, gently, that I needed people around me whom I never had to question, people whose loyalty didn't come with conditions, and people I didn't have to wonder about when I wasn't in the room. I needed to know that if someone had a problem with me, they would come to me instead of making plans behind my back. I think somewhere underneath the shame he carried, Preston understood. He didn't argue.
He didn't try to convince me that I was wronged. He simply said, I understand. Maybe that was the first truly honest thing we'd said to each other in a long time. Callie is the reason I still believe in the good in people. And I want to spend a moment telling you what I did for her, because she is the sweet part of this story. Every story like mine ought to have a sweet part. Otherwise, all the pain just becomes pain. And I don't believe that's the whole truth of life. 2 weeks after that Sunday evening at the dining room table, I sat down with Ed Sloan and completely restructured my will and my personal holdings. I wanted everything to be clear. I didn't want anyone making assumptions later. I didn't want family members fighting over paperwork. And I certainly didn't want anyone trying to quietly move something around while someone else wasn't paying attention. So I set up an irrevocable trust in Callie's name. I funded it with the proceeds from the Sunset Mountain House after I eventually went through with the sale, along with a 12% ownership stake in the company itself. That stake was held separately from the company's daily operations, so no matter what happens to me, Callie would have something real, something permanent, and something that no one could quietly maneuver away from her while she wasn't looking. That mattered to me, maybe more than anything else. I also paid off her student loans in full. I did it quietly, without making a big announcement, because I didn't want the gesture to become another transaction. I didn't want her to feel as if I'd given her something so that she owed me something in return. I simply remembered what she had said. Months earlier, when I had asked her if she knew anything about her mother's plans, she had looked at me and told me that the only thing she cared about was making sure I knew she wasn't going anywhere. She wasn't going anywhere. Those words had stayed with me, so I wanted her to know that I had heard her. I wanted to answer those words in the way they deserved to be answered. I didn't tell her about everything immediately. I wanted the lawyers to finish the paperwork first. I wanted everything protected and properly documented. But when the time was right, I sat down with her and explained what I had done. She started crying. I told her, "You don't owe me anything." She shook her head and said, "I know." And then she hugs me. That was enough. Sometimes the most meaningful things in life don't require a speech. Sometimes they are simply two people sitting in the same room, both knowing that the other person stayed when it would have been easier to leave. I still go into the shop most mornings now. I'm slower than I used to be. There's no point pretending otherwise. At 66, I don't move around that shop like I did when I was 35. My right hand still shakes a little by the end of a long day. Some mornings, it takes me longer to get everything moving the way I want it to. There are days when I have to stop, breathe, and remind myself that I don't have to prove anything to anybody anymore. But I still stand at that workbench beside Miguel, and we build things together the way we always have. Wood doesn't care about your age. It doesn't care about your divorce. It doesn't care about the people who betrayed you. It doesn't care about the money someone tried to take. Wood only asks you to pay attention. You measure twice, you cut once. You make a mistake, you learn how to correct it. And if the piece can still be saved, you save it. There is something peaceful about that. There is a calm in that shop now that I hadn't felt for a very long time before all of this happened. Maybe it is because the people standing inside it actually want to be there. Maybe it is because I no longer spend my mornings wondering who is saying what behind my back. Maybe it is because the business is finally surrounded by people who understand that trust isn't something you demand, it is something you earn. I think about that anniversary dinner sometimes. I remember the candles. I remember the china we only brought out twice a year. I remember the table. I remember the way the room suddenly felt too quiet. And most of all, I remember that sentence. Dead weight, but we love them anyway. At the time, those words felt like a door slamming shut. They made me question years of my life in a single moment. They made me wonder how long people had been thinking that way about me. They made me wonder whether I had somehow become blind to what was happening around me. I understand now that she never meant the second half of that sentence at all. The "we love him anyway" part was never real. But I don't spend much time being angry about it anymore, because I think about something else. I think about Miguel's worn little notebook, the one with the rubber band wrapped around it, the notebook he had been keeping records in for years. I think about Callie's voice on the phone when she told me she wasn't going anywhere. I think about the people who didn't need to announce their loyalty because they simply showed it through their actions. And I understand something else now, too. Something I don't think I ever would have learned if that phone hadn't rung at 11:14 that night. The people who are actually going to carry you when it matters are rarely the people sitting closest to you at the table. Sometimes they're the people sitting quietly in the background. Sometimes they're the ones keeping records in a locked cabinet 15 years before you ever need those records. Sometimes they're the people who don't ask for anything in return. Sometimes they're the ones who call you every week just to ask how your hand is doing expecting nothing back at all. And sometimes the people you think are closest to you are the very people you need to step away from. That was probably the hardest lesson for me. I used to think family meant you automatically trusted someone. Now I understand that family can be important, but trust is still earned. Love can be given freely. Trust has to be built. And loyalty isn't proven by what someone says when you're sitting across from them at a dinner table. It's proven by what they do when you're not there to see it. I'm 66 years old. I've still got sawdust in my lungs, plenty of unfinished projects in the shop, and more years of work left in these hands, shaking or not. I still wake up some mornings thinking about what happened. I still have moments when I remember that night and feel the same coldness in my chest. But those moments don't own me anymore. I built something once out of a 2-car garage and a used Ford truck. I've built a business from almost nothing. I built relationships. I built a family. Some of those relationships turned out to be stronger than I imagined. Some turned out to be weaker than I ever wanted to believe. And when everything finally came apart, I had to decide what I was going to build next. So I built it again. Only this time, I built it quieter. I built it steadier. I built it around people who had already proven who they were. And I built it out of a $1,500 an hour lesson about who actually deserves a seat at your table. If there's one thing I hope you take away from my story, it's this. Don't wait until everything falls apart to pay attention to the people who have been quietly showing you who they are. Pay attention to the person who keeps their word. Pay attention to the person who shows up when there is nothing in it for them. Pay attention to the person who protects you when you aren't in the room. Pay attention to the person who tells you the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable. Those are the people worth keeping close. And if someone only stays close because they think they can benefit from you, eventually, you'll find that out too. It may hurt. It may change your life. It may make you question everything you thought you knew. But sometimes losing the wrong people is how you finally make room for the right ones. That's what happened to me. I thought I was losing my business. I thought I was losing my marriage. I thought I was losing my family. What I didn't understand at first was that I was also being given a chance to see clearly. And once I could see clearly, I could finally choose what came next. I chose peace. I chose honesty. I chose Miguel. I chose Cal. I chose the people who had already chosen me when there was nothing to gain. And most importantly, I chose myself again. Not the man I had been before the stroke. Not the man who thought working harder could solve every problem. Not the man who believed that because someone shared his last name, he could automatically trust them. But the man who had learned that life is too short to spend it sitting at a table where people think of you as dead weight. So these days, when I walk into the shop in the morning and smell the fresh cut wood, when I hear the machines starting up and see Miguel already looking over the day's work, I feel something I haven't felt in years. Gratitude. Not because everything happened the way I wanted. It didn't. Not because the betrayal didn't hurt. It did. Not because I got some kind of perfect ending. I didn't. But because I came out the other side, knowing exactly who was there. And sometimes that knowledge is worth more than anything money can buy. I still have plenty of work to do. There are chairs to build, tables to finish, orders to fill, people to teach. And there are mornings when my hand shakes and I have to slow down. That's all right. I've learned that slowing down doesn't mean you've stopped. Sometimes slowing down is how you finally notice what you've been missing. Sometimes it is how you finally hear the truth. And sometimes it is how you finally see the people who were standing beside you all along. So that's where I am now. 66 years old. Still working, still learning, still building, still trying to be a better man than I was yesterday. And if I have learned anything from all of this, it's that the people who deserve a place at your table aren't necessarily the people who have been sitting there the longest. They're the people who would pull up a chair when you had nothing to offer them. They're the people who would stay after everyone else had left. They're the people who would carry you when you couldn't carry yourself. Those are the people I have now. And for the first time in a long time, that's enough. If you enjoyed the story, go ahead and hit that like button, leave a comment, and tell us where you're listening from tonight. And if you haven't subscribed already, consider subscribing because there is always another story here worth staying for. There is always another lesson, another unexpected turn, another reminder that sometimes the hardest chapters of our lives lead us toward the people and places where we were meant to be. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. And remember, sometimes the person you think is carrying your burden is actually adding to it, while the person standing quietly in the background is the one who has been holding you up the entire time. I'll see you in the next one.